of a sudden have that erased within just a matter of 10 years down to 46%. I don't know about you, but that's one hell of a drop. That's a scary drop. That's something that's pretty much phenomenal. How does something like that happen in just a manner of just 10 years? I don't know about you, but for me, that sounds like something's fishy is going on. Something's wrong with this picture. It's something that we need to dig into and try to wrap our minds around and see what's really going on. In that same period, single mothers averaged roughly around 12.5%. So, what I mean by that same period from 1880 to 1960, single mothers raising their children was roughly around 12.5%. Then within that same 10 years, from 1970 to 1980, it went from 12.5% up to 33%. So it doubled. It more than doubled in just 10 years. Something that was steady from 1880 to 1960 at just idling as low as 12.5% in just 10 years from 1970 to 1980. Doubled, more than doubled, to 33%. Now, on top of that, at the same time, the white American family structure of two-parent households remained steady at roughly 89%. So, from 1880 to 1980, the white American family structure was pretty much steady. No alterations, no 10-year hole for them to fall into. Strange. And at the same time, single mothers in white Americans only increased by 4%. By 4%. So, though the African American mothers, single mothers, went from 12.5% in 1960 to increase to 33% in 1980, the single mothers in white America only went from 4.5% to 9% in that same 10-year span. Now that's strange. To me, that sounds like a phenomenon. To me, that sounds like what the young people of Occupy Wall Street is going through right now, because it's a phenomenon. Something strange is going on. That we look from 1880 to 1960. No alterations in the family structure whatsoever. Those are a lot of years covered, people. Off the top of my head, I can't even do the math right now. All I can tell you, that was a long time that we were idling at 70%. And you mean to tell me in just 10 years, we can drop from 70% to 46% is what I said? 46% in just 10 years. That single mamas, baby mamas, or whatever you want to call them today, can go from 12.5% from 1880 to 1960 to increase up to 33% in just 10 years. Hear me, people. Hear me. This goes into when I talk about in my book, the chapter, Who Planted Those Weeds? We blame the weeds for their existence. We blame the ugliness that we see. We blame the fathers that's not in the homes that's destroying the foundations of the families. But we're not blaming the people who caused this or the events that caused this. This is a phenomenon, people. This is something that which you can literally say something that happened overnight. And we ain't talking about a one community. We talking about nationwide. I hope you hear me. I hope you're feeling me. I hope you're following me. A phenomenon in just 10 years. So let's focus on a 10-year span. Let's focus on 1970 to 1980. Let's just focus on it. It's just one little pocket. Mind you, keep in mind, 1970 and 1980, Reagan didn't step into office until 1980. So we ain't even talking about the crack epidemic. We ain't even talking about the crack hitting the streets. Cracks wasn't even invented yet. Cracks wasn't even heard of from 1970 to 1980. Wasn't mentioned in our culture, in our communities. Crack was not an issue. If I'm wrong, but I feel I'm right. Heroin and marijuana was something that was probably running rampant in the African American communities. Heroin, because you had a lot of your Vietnam vets coming back from Vietnam, strung out on that heroin. Heroin was during the eras of Frank Lucas up there in New York. So heroin was going out there, was in the streets, but crack wasn't. Crack wasn't. Heroin probably was a little bit before my time, so I don't really know too much about the news articles and the effects that heroin had in the African American communities, like I know what crack did in the African American communities. But marijuana was prevalent. That's when you had your $5 bags, I'm sure. So we want to focus on what events could have possibly had transpired between 1970 and 1980. Now, as we go into this direction, this will probably shed light on what I discussed in our previous topic, how America has become a crackhead, and when I shed some light on what happened during these presidential administrations, the events that transpired into our own economic collapse. And this is when I was trying to shed light to the people out there how at that time, because it was an African American epidemic and not America's epidemic, it was something that was going on in the shadows, something that people really didn't focus or bring much attention to because it wasn't affecting their communities where they were at. It was just our problem. So, African American men up into the mid-70s were attending colleges at record numbers. Around the same time, they began to gradually turn from going to college into going to jail. So let me back up. Around the 70s, because what we're talking about just after the civil rights movement of the 60s, you had a lot of African American men attending colleges. They were going to school, getting their education. If you remember the Black Panther Party, these are the students of that era with Fred Hampton and Huey P. Newton and Stokely Carmichael. These kids were in college. The SNCC, these marchers and these organizers were college students. So they were going to school. They were pursuing a higher education. And they were coming out. Mind you, there were some that were still poor, that were still struggling during that era. But I'm quite sure the dropout rate is nothing like what we see today, especially amongst our African American men. So what I'm saying is, I'm saying two things. You saw a high volume of African American men going to college. At the same time, we saw a lot of African American men going to jail just after the civil rights movement was passed. Reason being, you had, like I said, when we speak of the Black Panthers and a lot of these activists and people out here that were fighting for liberation in the streets in the 60s during the riots, Think about it. The riots, a lot of your political prisoners, they started going from, after the success of the civil rights movement, start going to jail as political prisoners. So that kind of like balance it out. That's why you starting to steadily see a high increase of African American men being incarcerated, while at the same time seeing a lot of African American men going on to college. So that's one aspect. Also during